pick up where we left off yesterday. We're studying these issues because they serve as a good background for that which we are seeing on Motzei Shabbat regarding the laws of building the temple. And in Hilchot Maaser Korbanot, Rambam has, of course, like he starts every section of his halachas with the relevant scriptural commandments, as at least according to his count. Rambam set down 613 commandments, 365 negative commandments, 248 positive commandments, and of course, very few Rishonim who also went about numbering the commandments actually agreed with him on all the details. And you've probably seen that's why there's discrepancies between the various lists. Be that as it may, in Hilchot Maaser Korbanot, he has 4 commandments, 2 positive and 2 negative. The first is that Lakriv Kol Korbanot Beveit HaBechira, to bring all of the sacrifices in Beit HaBechira. Once again, that's a particular epithet that he uses for the temple. The sages use it sometimes, but he uses it specifically when he talks about the halachot, even though within that branch of halachot, he replaces this word with a temple, which is interesting. He uses the word mikdash or just habayit. Interesting, in the halachas itself, he doesn't say Beit HaBechira, but the title of the mitzvahs does have this term, indicating its chosenness. And as we said before, the chosenness is the fact that a prophet has revealed this fact to us. It doesn't mean, for example, like we think anthropomorphically, when a man has a choice, he has an option of Pepsi or Coca-Cola. No, it means that God has revealed that something or someone or some place is the subject of, is the subject of certain commandments, or is been designated for a certain choice, for a certain purpose. So the people of Israel, for example, are the chosen people. It's not that God chose us among the people and he was basically deciding, well, does he want the Jews or the Greeks or the Chinese? No, he has revealed that we are the ones who are going to be bearing his covenant among all the other peoples. That's what it means. So this is a positive commandment to bring the sacrifices in his chosen temple. And the other one is to levi kodshe chutz la'aretz levei bechira, and also to bring all sacrificial items. Kodshe, there shouldn't be a vav in this word, by the way, but Machon Mamre puts these in to indicate that it's a kamatz katan. I'm opposed to that, whatever. He says that if you have kodashim in chutz la'aretz, for every reason, someone dedicated an animal for sacrificial purposes or dedicated funds to the temple, so it's a commandment to bring them to the temple. The 2 negative commandments are to not slaughter sacrifices outside of the temple courtyard, and we said that that's the main courtyard surrounding the Kodesh. It does not refer to the outer courtyard or any of the courtyards beyond the outer courtyard, which we said was called the women's courtyard sometimes. Those places are all disqualified for the slaughter of sacrifice, and not to, and this is an interesting verb, not to bring or not to sacrifice. It just jumped in there. Sorry, I clicked on it the wrong way. Okay. They're not to offer sacrifice outside of the Azarah. What is the difference between these things? Well, this one literally means the act of slaughtering. In this case, l'hakriv means to bring the parts of the animal to the altar. That is, put the blood on the altar, bring the blood to the altar and apply the blood to the altar. And I guess the parts of that would get burned on the altar. If it's a burnt offering, it's the entire thing. If it's let's say a peace offering of which the meat is eaten, so this would refer to the forbidden fats and the other parts that are specifically burned and not eaten. So you have that over here. That is the two negative commandments. And the heter bamot, which we discussed yesterday, that is a suspension of these 4 commandments. When the heter bamot was in effect, Jewish people were allowed to bring their sacrifice to other places. That is, we see, for example, the prophet Samuel regularly sacrificed in, let's say, in Ramah, where he lived, or in Bethlehem, where he visited Jesse when he wanted to anoint one of his sons. That was perfectly normal, and there was no commandment to bring these sacrificial items. Also, let's say the bull that he is going to make which he was going to make into a peace offering, there's no commandment if it came from Chutz La'aretz to bring it to the place where the temple was currently standing. And according to Maimonides' definition, it was at Nov at the time. And that's why there was no prohibition also. These prohibitions of slaughtering and then offering sacrifice outside of the Azarah just did not apply. And that's something we have to know about. So this particular issue of Heter Bamot was something that the Jewish people picked up right away. In the entire chapter of the entire 22nd chapter of Joshua describes how the Transjordanian tribes, when they were released from their obligation by Joshua, they helped conquer the land and they ensured that everybody got their peace. Joshua then sent them, okay, you kept your side of the deal, you get to own the entire eastern side of the Jordan River. He sent them away, and it says that they went and built themselves an altar for show. Basically, it was monumental and symbolic, but not meant for sacrifice. But that was a scandal that enveloped the entire Jewish people, who were basically ready to go to war against the Transjordanian tribes for this terrible sin of, God forbid, building a place of sacrifice beyond the sanctuary at Shiloh. And the tribes of Reuven and Gad and part of Manasseh, half, it doesn't really mean half, it just means some of the families from among that, the 8 families of Manasseh, they had to assure their brethren, no, they would never do such a thing. And we don't find anywhere else in the book of Joshua, even though, yes, there were some parts where we find that in various generations they had backsliding into idolatry. This was not a sin that they were doing on a major level. There's no real criticism. Unlike, let's say, the book of Kings, where we see that every king of Yehuda, starting with Solomon until all, and including all of his successors, are basically judged by the prophets for not doing away with the high places, that is, private altars. For some reason, shortly after the construction of the first temple and its dedication, people went back to this. They apparently got so used to offering sacrifice wherever they wanted to during those 54 years before the temple was built, that it became ingrained. It became part of their religious practice that they had a hard time giving up. And even worse, in the northern kingdom, in the kingdom of Israel, that had revolted against the Davidic monarchy, they not only had sacrifice outside the temple, they actually declared these are rival temples. That was the thing that Yerovam had decided. He wanted to keep people away from Jerusalem, so he created new shrines that were actually called Beit Habamot, or Beit Bamot, in Bethel and in Dan, to make it convenient for Jews to offer their sacrifice. So this was the problem of the first temple times. And also, by the way, we saw that Hezekiah was declared the greatest of all the kings at the time, most righteous, because he was the one who finally did away with this practice. And as I like to say, you have to think every prime minister of Israel is basically guilty of the same crimes. That is, they have done many things to prevent the Jewish people from offering sacrifice at the temple. They have not rebuilt the temple or taken any steps whatsoever to make it better for Jews to want to go visit the temple. Instead, they're investing in false shrines like Meron, Yad Vashem, and the Kotel Plaza, which are all replacements for what should be the center of Jewish worship. And I hope that, God willing, politics are disgusting, and politics and rabbinics do not match, just like politics and medicine should have nothing to do with each other, but unfortunately they do. I would give my vote for the man who advocates for the rebuilding of the temple. And so far, there hasn't been a serious contender for prime minister yet, but God willing, that will be the case. So what is the source or the reason for this? So we saw that the Meiri suggested, well, what do you mean by this? This temporary suspensions that existed. We saw the Meiri's position, which was adopted by many, that the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there. But the problem was, we saw in Zvachim, I translated this source. You could look it up yourself. It says, no, it was a limud. It's a exposition from the various verses. There would be a time in Jewish history before they get to the Menucha and the Nachalah, which would allow it. And this is a section from Rambam's Perush HaMishnayot explaining the situation that existed in Gilgal. Why? This limud over here, which is in both Talmudim, explains why it is that they were able to offer sacrifice, to basically ignore those 4 commandments that we saw at the beginning, why they were able to ignore them in between the times when the sanctuary stood at Shiloh and when it was finally built in Jerusalem. That explains when the Mishkan was standing in Nov and Givon. But what about in Gilgal? In Gilgal, it was the same Mishkan that they had in Arvot Moav and at Sinai, and the Jews had to offer sacrifice there. And somehow they transplanted the Mishkan over the course of 3 days from Arvot Moav, and then the Shittim, that was called. It was in the plains of Moab. The last stop was the Shittim, Shin Tov Yud Mem, and then they crossed into Gilgal, and it was the same Mishkan, it was the same Mikdash, it was the same Joshua in charge of the people, same high priest, but now they were allowed to offer sacrifice wherever they wanted within the land of Canaan. What allowed for that? What was the halachic mechanism? So the Rambam says over here, I'll read over here, Lefi Shatala Ketuv Isra B'mot B'machaneh. The Isra B'mot, this prohibition of offering sacrifice outside the central sanctuary, was contingent on the camp. What is the camp? As described at the beginning of the book of Numbers in Bamidbar. There was the central sanctuary, the Levites encamped around it, and each Israelite tribe surrounded the Levites, and each tribe had its assigned place. So the tribe of Yehuda and Yisachar and Zevulun were on the east, and Ruvain, Shimon, and Gad on the south, Ephraim, Menashe, Binyamin on the west, Dan, Naphtali, and Asher on the north side. And that's the way it had to be. And he's basically saying that once they got into the land of Canaan, they were no longer camping around the Mishkan the way they were supposed to. He continues, the commandment specifically says one who slaughters an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, and the pasuk continues. He doesn't have the whole one here. He doesn't have the rest of the pasuk over here, where it says, but he did not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. So he says, "V'natan tam bazeh l'man asher yaviu b'nei Yisrael tzivcheihem," and the reason given there, right in the middle of Parashat Acharei Moth, is so that the Jewish people bring their slaughtered sacrifices to God and not do it, out in the open. They used to worship demons that way. It says there. This would be Isur Bamot. And it says because from the time they no longer had Machanot, the Rav Kapach translate Hisul Machanot. Here the previous translator said Pasku Machanot. The Machanot were no longer there. He says Hisul Machanot, with the elimination of the camps. V'nichnesu la'aretz, and they entered the land, the promised land. Rotzalomar Eretz Canaan, which means Eretz Canaan. V'hu azman shebo leGilgal. That's when they arrived at Gilgal. Nis talka mitzvat lo tasezov v'nishar mutar. This prohibition, or this "thou shalt not" commandment, just disappeared, and it was left permitted. That was sacrifice outside of the sanctuary was suddenly permitted. So this is the mechanism, the halachic mechanism, that allowed for the heter b'mot in the time of Gilgal, which is distinct from the mechanism that allowed for the heter b'mot when the Mishkan stood in Nov and Givon. Now, here's something that I was pointing out to these disputants, and that is, according to the non-Maimonidean school, what allows for heter b'mot in any time and place is the presence or the absence of the Ark of the Covenant. When the Ark of the Covenant is in the sanctuary, so there is a prohibition to offer sacrifice outside that sanctuary. But if the Ark of the Covenant is removed somehow, then sacrifice can be offered elsewhere. So the question is, so why does the Mishnah discuss these periods of time? The Mishnah basically says when the Mishkan was in a certain place, then there was a heter b'mot, or then there was an isur b'mot. The Mishnah could have just told us when the ark was in the sanctuary, the b'mot were forbidden, and when the ark was outside of the sanctuary, for whatever reason, usually it's because they went off to war, then the b'mot were permitted, and that would explain every instance we have in the Bible of sacrifice within or without of the central sanctuary. But the fact is that that's not the way the Mishnah has it. That's not the way the Talmud has it. Basically pointing to, like the Rambam is very exact in saying, it depends on the time period. There are certain times when it was permitted and certain times it was prohibited, and this can all be derived from inferences from the particular verses in the Torah and strictly in the Torah. You don't even have to look in the Navi for inferences about this one. I was surprised also that the Hevel Nahalato, once again, you can find the whole text online. It's a good sefer. So there's a lot to argue there. There's a lot of interesting essays in there. He says, he basically holds like Maimonides halfway. I bolded this over here. The bolding was mine. He says, Yeshnasi bab is man no v'givon sharon lo hayabim komo. Says the reason for the heter bamot when the sanctuary was at Nov Givon was because the Aron was not there. And then he adds, V'az mizbeach yirad mimadregato liot bama gedolah. So that's why the mizbeach was called a bama gedolah, which makes it slightly inferior, became inferior. This is the part that I was disputing. According to what Rambam says, it was not inferior, and it's not because the ark wasn't there. But then he says this reason that there was no prohibition in the times of Gilgal was because he says here, Batla chaluka lemachanot shchina levia v'Yisrael. This division of the Jewish camp into the Machaneh Shechina, which he said that was the courtyard of the temple, and the Levitic camp and the Israelite camp was no longer, and even though the Mishkan stood exactly as it was, so he calls that once again it became inferior. It was not on the same level as it used to be. So it was now called a Bama Gedolah, just a central high place, and we're going to see soon that also what is the source for this term Bama Gedolah. What does it actually mean in context? Here we have Rabbi Yassa's rule. Rabbi Yassa's rule was the one in the Rishalmi Megillah who had this Havamina, which was, as I tried to point out, was rejected by the Rishalmi, that perhaps the Heter Bamot is contingent on the ark being within the sanctuary or not, and it was actually picked up by many. I don't know why, so you could go find it there. Here's a corresponding section from the Rishalmi, and this is important one. I also put it in the translation, where it says, "Thus, while the tent of meeting stood during the sojourn in the wilderness, the Bamoth were prohibited, and Gilgal was permitted. In Shiloh, once again prohibited. Nov and Givon permitted." And it says here, based on this pasuk from the Menucha and Nachalah, it's like a man told the servants, "Do not drink wine from Tiberias, nor from Caesarea, nor from Sepphoris," implying that from areas between those places he could drink wine. So too, we see in the pasuk it says, "Don't offer sacrifice outside the temple during the Menucha and during the Nachalah," implying that there be a time in the middle. And here I have that rule also, that basically Rabbi Yassa's rule is not a rule, but more like a mnemonic. But even then, it's rejected because it leads to halachic propositions which are untenable. Namely, that if one were to remove the Ark of the Covenant from the temple on a permanent basis, or not even on permanent, by permanent I mean outside of the Temple Mount, apparently, if you would take the Ark of the Covenant just into, let's say, the new city of Jerusalem, then what would happen was it would somehow allow for sacrifice outside the temple, which is untenable. Here are some of the scriptural sources which we have for the Maimonidean / Talmudic understanding of this issue. This is 1 Kings 9:25. Right after the dedication of the temple, we see that Solomon received a message from God. Either it seems to be, as the pasuk says, that Solomon got this message directly, just like God appeared to him when he first went to Givon. The pasuk says, "And God appeared to him in Jerusalem, just like he had appeared to him in Givon." There are other times in the book where they point out that God said to Solomon, it means through the agency of a prophet. In this case, this was direct as prophecy could be. Once again, go look at the more in Nevuchim there for all the different levels of prophecy. The Rambam says even the prophet himself doesn't get direct prophecy from God except for Moses. That was his level. Everybody has it through some sort of ministering angel who delivers the message. Be that as it may, this is a prophecy that was not given through some other prophet. It says God said to him, or the Lord said to him, "Shemata et tefilatecha et hinatecha asher hananta lefanai hikdashti et habayit hazeh asher banitha." I have heard your prayer and your supplication, which you have supplicated before me. I have sanctified this temple that you have built, lasum shemi sham ad olam, in order to place my name there forever. So you see here, God put his name there forever. That means the godly presence is in the temple all the time. Regardless of the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. And King David had declared this also when he discovered the place of the temple. Really, David knew. This is a longer share. David knew that the temple needed to be in Jerusalem. It says that's why he chose Jerusalem as his capital, and he had discovered that with the prophet Samuel. He knew where to put the temple, but he did not know where to put the altar. Well, it shouldn't be obvious if you know where the temple's supposed to go. The altar is just slightly to the east of the temple. No, he had a ballpark estimate of which city was supposed to be, but he did not know exactly where to put the altar, and that would tell him where to put the rest of the temple. Once you know the altar is in the middle, so the rest of the temple basically finds its place. The altar is I guess the marker of where to put everything else in relation to it. So David only discovered the altar later in his reign after that I guess historical plague that resulted in God eventually revealing to him where to put the altar. So he said, it says in Chronicles, this is the part that's left out. This is right after the book of Samuel ends. We don't see how David reacted to the fact that his sacrifice was accepted at that point. David said, this is the house of the Lord God. Zem is Israel. And this must be the altar for the burnt offering from Israel, even though the sanctuary at the time, like it says in the next verse, happened to have been in Givon. That's where the altar was. He says, no, this is where it's supposed to be. This is where God's house is supposed to be. Which, by the way, just a little bit of Musar. We were talking about in the last 2 years with the whole China virus pandemic. Many of us early on were just saying, oh, this is a plague. This is this is affecting people out there in China. It's their own fault. Some people are saying racist things, that they deserve it. It's because they eat disgusting foods and they have those wet markets. It's not going to affect us. And then lo and behold, the problem that was from the opposite side of the world became our problem, became everybody's problem. And we shouldn't have reacted that way. I mean, I know many righteous people were not reacting that way. But I'm just saying that there are people, who they were reacting this way, and many of us maybe felt that in our hearts, that this is something that cannot affect us, and that's something that affects them because we're better than them. And we should have learned our lessons, that really when these things happen, we're supposed to repent and take notice and understand what God is trying to tell us. So too, now we see that there's war going on elsewhere in this world, and it's a little bit closer to home. Many Jewish people fled the Eastern Europe, places like Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. That's where the majority of Ashkenazic Jewry came from. That's where my grandparents came from. And we look at these people, sometimes some people have other ideas. Let them fight it out. Who cares? It's not my war. That's not a proper way of thinking about it. One, God's trying to send us a message. Two, we should care about Gentiles killing each other. That's a terrible thing. Our messianic ideal is that Gentiles not make war with each other. And also, we have to worry about people like the current Soviet dictator of Russia. People like him usually end up being very bad for the Jews. His predecessors were very bad to us. The Soviet dictators of Russia, while they're in charge, made life terrible for the Russian Jews and killed many Jews. Stalin wasn't, he may have helped beat Hitler, Ymach Shemo, but he wasn't that much better than Hitler. And go read the writings of Rabbi Soloveitchik to find that. People like that are usually not good for us. Right now, he's distracted with oppressing other people. But I just know, you look in history, people like that tend not to be good, and we have to pray that for peace. And we hope that people get along with each other, and certainly they don't turn attention to us, because these things usually don't work out good for the Jews. Instead, we should focus on the commandments, which we have been ignoring. Even King David, basically, his generation ignored the commandments relevant to the temple, and that's why they suffered plagues and they lost people in war until they got their act together. Here we have the next source in Psalms 132. It's quite a short psalm, but you see here, these psukim talk about how the temple was chosen forever. Ki v'char Hashem b'tzion yiwa l'moshavlo, and it connects that with the fact that God chose David and his children forever to rule in Jerusalem. And it says, Zot menuchati adayad. This is the verse that Marambam actually brings when he says, at the beginning of the Halachot, we saw in Beta Bechira, the first chapter, he says that this is the source for the fact that once the temple was placed in Jerusalem, it is no longer to be moved to another place. See, the scriptural sources. And we have here about the Holy of Holies being holier than everywhere else. That's what the Rambam says. It's the holiest place because, why? What makes the Holy of Holies the holiest? Not that it houses the Ark of the Covenant, but rather because only the Kohen Gadol could go in there. And here we have a piece of Moreh Nevuchim describing this Holy of Holies. It is evident that the object of giving different degrees of sanctity to the different places, Temple Mount, the place between the walls, the two walls, to the women's courtyard, to the hall, that's the ulam, that's the room, the first room of the temple edifice that was added in the temple. It didn't exist in the Mishkan as it was, which only had two rooms. And also we saw that this room didn't have a doorway. It had a doorway, but didn't have an actual door or gate that was ever closed. And so on up to the Holy of Holies was to raise the respect and reverence of the temple in the minds of all who approached it. These two lines from Rambam basically have a very rational view of the holiness of a Holy of Holies. It is holier because admission is extremely limited. And the whole point is to instill reverence in people. It has nothing to do with that. That place is uh, God's, so to speak, resting place. That place has more Shekhinah. No, the entire temple has God's presence. It's not that that place has the Kruvim or the Ark of the Covenant or any other holy item. No, it's holier because God declared it as such, and so that we have this reverence in our mind that certain places are holier and are off limits to the rest of us. That's it. That's a very Maimonidean view. By the way, that seems to be what the Talmud is saying. The Talmud doesn't say it as explicitly as Maimonides does, but this line over here, this is a Talmudic line. This is in the Mishnah explicitly, and Rambam's explanation seems to make sense. Like most things, I wouldn't argue with the Rambam on most things because what are you going to do? He's usually right. The Radbaz has a classic question about this one. This is a great Radbaz. Radbaz is one of the commentaries on the Mishnah Torah. The 10 levels of sanctity within the land of Israel. It says one of those lines that, once again, is that from the Mishnayot and Kelim, which the Rambam is explicit about, which we saw in previous Shirim. He says that the land of Israel is holier than all the other lands, sanctified above all of them. What is its sanctity? From there, that's where we bring the Omer, the Bikurim, and the 2 loaves of bread on. That's what they bring on Shavuot, the Shtei Alechem. Now, I would have said that the land of Israel is holier than other lands. Some people say it's because it was promised to the forefathers. It was promised to them, and it's the land of the Jews, or it's the land in which you could find God's presence. But that's not what the Mishnah says. That's not what Rambam brings as the halacha. The land is holier because we perform certain mitzvahs through the land. That is, we bring the Korban Omer and the Bikurim and the loaves of bread. And that's kind of surprising because I understand these as commandments that are contingent on the land, but there's a whole corpus of halachot, the mitzvot hatuluyot ba'aretz, the commandments that depend on land. Many of them, all the agricultural commandments. Why just these 3? You take, for example, Shemitah. Shemitah is one of the prime commandment that unites all of these commandments that we say are contingent upon the land. And it's the one upon which our very possession of the land is conditioned. We have to keep Shemitah in order to hold on to land. If we do not keep Shemitah, as we saw before, then we lose our rights to hold on to the land. So why didn't the Mishnah say the land of Israel is holier? Because that's where the mitzvot apply. And outside the land of Israel, there are no agricultural mitzvahs, as we know. But instead, the Mishnah says because that's where you have to bring the Omer. Yeah. Oh, sorry. That's the place from which you have to bring the Omer, the Bikurim, and the Shtei Alechem. So why does he say that? So it's a good answer. He says that the Mishnah was aware that the main sanctity of the land is transient. Technically speaking, the sanctity of the land is transient. That's another thing that the Rambam says. The temple's sanctity is permanent. The land can lose its sanctity. And indeed, apparently that's the way he understands the sugya. He's not the only one. The Rambam understands that when the temple was first destroyed, that is, the first temple was destroyed and the Jewish people were taken into the Babylonian exile, the land stopped being holy. Yes, it's still the promised land. It's still our possession. And we still have a commandment to go back there and settle it and form a commonwealth and rebuild the temple. But the mitzvot did not apply during that time. That is, Shemitah and Yovel cycles were suspended. No one was counting toward those anymore. And no one, if you had survivors, like the 2 guys who were living in the Galilee, so they had a wheat field and a grapevine, so they did not have the usual commandments applied to them. They didn't have to take tithes from that which they grew. The commandments didn't exist because the land wasn't holy, and the land only regained its holiness once the Jewish people came back from the Babylonian exile and reestablished their commonwealth, what they call the Bia Shnia, the second coming, and the Yemei Ezra. And the Rambam even attributes to this the second act of sanctification to Ezra, although it's not exact. Apparently it happened a little bit before Ezra, but it was in his time that they start counting toward this. So the land's sanctity lapsed, but the temple's sanctity did not. And because the temple's sanctity did not, technically speaking, during the times of the Babylonian exile, survivors could, if they could somehow get their act together and offer sacrifice at the place of the temple, they would need to find grain from which to offer these sacrifices. Yes, they could not farm and, let's say, take tithes from their grain, but they still had to find barley from which to bring the Omer and wheat in order to make these Pentecostal loaves. And that's what they had to do. That's called the Bikurim, by the way. And because these commandments are contingent on the temple, and they never lost their sanctity because the temple never lost its sanctity, that's why the Mishnah describes the sanctity of the land in a permanent manner. The Mishnah could have said what makes the land of Israel holy, all the mitzvot that apply in the land, or these specific commandments. And it chose these specific commandments because these ones are connected to the temple, and the temple is always the temple, and its sanctity is eternal and is never suspended like that of the temples, like the land, the sanctity of the land, which is a very good answer. It's a wonderful thing. Go see that in the Radbaz inside. Learn it a few times. It's amazing. Also, were the temple's sanctity conditional like that of the land's sanctity, as the Miri and the Meshech Chachma claim? So you could have said Havamina, that he would have just said so, where the Rambam talks about the sanctity of the land being conditional. Here he talks about, this is taken from the Sefer HaMitzvot, and he says here that Bnei Yisrael should yadru me'eretz Yisrael. If chas v'shalom you'd have, he says Chalila, if you would have such a thing that there are no longer any Jews ever in the land of Israel, which has never been the case. Even the Babylonians left behind some people, and even when the Byzantines finally finished the work of their Roman predecessors of emptying the land of Israel, there were always some Jews left. Take, for example, Pekin, which they say had a continuous Jewish settlement from the times of the Second Temple until the modern era, and only now is becoming weaker. So he says that would be impossible type of thing to say, but the land would lose its sanctity. Now let's read it inside. He says here, God, of course, won't do such a thing. God has already promised that he will not do such a thing. The people of Israel are eternal, and there has to therefore be a Jewish presence constantly in the land. If there would never be a Jewish court in the land of Israel, or there wouldn't be a court outside the land of Israel that had been ordained in the land of Israel, this cheshbon that we use to calculate our current calendar would be worthless, because it relies on the fact that there's always a Jewish community in the land of Israel. Really, we have no right to calculate the calendar. That is to decide which months start when, and when to add leap years, and when to extend the months. See, this is adding leap years. So by adding leap year means adding a month to the year. We have no right to do such thing in Chutz La'aretz. So this what Rambam is saying here. So this commandment is conditional on the Jews living there. So I would have figured that if, let's say, the temple sanctity was also conditional on the presence of the ark, or as Rambam says, you have to always have Jews in the land of Israel. It must be there's always Jews in the land of Israel. Otherwise, our calendar won't work. We wouldn't even have Judaism. We wouldn't know when to celebrate the holidays. So the Jews are always in the land of Israel. There's always a Jewish community with a beis din of at least 3 rabbanim sitting there. That's what makes the calendar work, and that's what got us through, let's say, the medieval period when the Rambam came to the land of Israel and couldn't find a minyan in Jerusalem with which to daven. So in that case, he said that the land was still, Judaism still continued going because in the merit of those Jews who were in the land of Israel. You would have expected Rambam to write something similar to that. Why do I keep the Ark of the Covenant on the Temple Mount at least, or within the Temple Mount? Because the temple sanctity is depending on that. And if Chas v'Shalom, the Ark would be removed, then the temple would lose its sanctity. But he never wrote such a thing. He did write this regarding other mitzvot, but not regarding the sanctity of the temple. So this is another, I guess, out of the way proof to show that Rambam says very clearly, not like the Miri, not like the Meshech Chachma, the sanctity of the temple is not contingent on the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. Over here, we have, so a good question. So why did Rambam actually rule on this historical point? This was a subject, just a piece of history. Where is the Ark? What happened to it? So the first is that, like with many examples we saw in the past, there's a lot of disputes in Chazal. And a lot of times the Rambam's ultimate answer for deciding a dispute is whichever has the best scriptural support. Sometimes you have 2 perfectly legitimate opinions among Tanaim, sages of the Mishnah, and Rambam will follow the one that could bring a scriptural proof to it. Even though they're both Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, they're both words of living God, this one seems to be the halacha because it has scriptural support. So that's why he seems to have it here. And I'm surprised also, like we saw before, the Rambam there in the fourth paragraph of Hilchot Beit Bechira is less describing what happened to the Ark of the Covenant and more about the location of the Even Ashtiyah, the foundation stone, the center, or at least the main feature placement of the Holy of Holies. I would have expected, let's say, the Meshech Chochmah to suggest that the temple emanates from the Even Ashtiyah. I didn't see that yet. I think there's some Kabbalistic ideas that maybe point to that, but I haven't seen them. If anybody has anything to share with me, I would very much appreciate that. Also, if anybody could correct me if I get anything wrong, that's also very important. So please let me know. So there you have it there. We're going to continue looking for more sources over here. I like to point out that there's this concept of ketubah. In order for a couple to stay married and be living with each other, they have to have their marriage contract. At least it has to be in existence, and they have to know where it is. Technically speaking, a couple could, let's say, have their marriage contract in their home back in New York, but they could visit New York and then continue on to Dubai. And even though they don't have their marriage contract wherever they're staying, as long as they know it's safe, it exists. But if they somehow discover, oh, look at that, the ketubah is gone. This has happened to people I know. Oops, no ketubah. So they got to separate basically until they could get themselves a proper scribe to write them a new marriage contract and in place of the original one. And then they could go back to normal. So a couple should always know where their marriage contract is. I'd like to say that. So too, Maimonides points out where the Ark of the Covenant is because that's the marriage contract between the Jewish people and God. God, so to speak, wrote his side of the bargain. Those are the tablets, which he wrote, so to speak, with his own finger. And the Torah scroll, which is written by Moses as the representative of the people, is written by him. And those two documents, those two tokens of the covenant, that's what they're called, those two tokens of the covenant are kept in the Ark of the Covenant in this Holy of Holies place, the place where God, so to speak, is alone with his chosen people. And that's a place why it's so forbidden. And Rav Schechter has a nice Torah about this one. Al Pi Kabbalah, there's a lot to say about that, how the relation be like a very loving, monogamous relationship between a man and his wife. And that's why also Jewish people going and worshiping idols is analogous in the words of the Torah and the prophets to adultery. And that's enough Va'amiv and Yavin. There's another idea here in the Midrash, which it has to explain why it is that Maimonides gives the history in a few places of the location of the temple and the location of the ark and the location of the altar. It's because we bought these places. There are places where it says in the Torah that they bought it. Abraham bought the Marasa Machpelah, the cave of the patriarchs. Jacob bought the place where he had pitched his tent outside of Shechem for 100 ksita, which, by the way, some say is a type of money, but I think that Targum is saying, like it says khurfan. They say, yeah, that also means a type of currency, but don't forget haruf in Arabic is a sheep, so it seems he paid for 100 sheep, which is a lot more than, let's say, 100 silver shekels or whatever this kisita is worth. Either way, he paid well for it. Jacob paid for his field, Abraham paid for his cave, and David paid for his mountain. And we hold on to these things. Why? Because we've had this strange, I wouldn't say fortune now, I had written fortune, but with a strange circumstance that we have to continually fight to contain our historical connection to our own land. No one's trying to take China and Beijing away from the Chinese, although the Chinese are trying to take away Taiwan and Hong Kong from other Chinese people, but that's besides the point. Nationally speaking, there's no foreign entity that's trying to do that. And the Bulgarians also, no one's trying to take away Bulgaria from the Bulgarians. And you see that the Ukrainians are fighting back, at least from their point of view. They're fighting against the Russians who are saying, well, Ukraine is technically ours forever. But you understand that every national group is standing up for what's theirs. The Jewish people have this strange malady that every now and then a large and noticeable minority are basically willing to national back in the 1990s and is becoming, thank God, less and less common. But that's what we did. And Maimonides Hold on, we're losing internet. Okay, we're back. Maimonides basically foresaw this, that one day our rights to these lands, to the temple, to the Maras Machpelah, ironically, and to Shechem, where are Jews basically not allowed to settle? Are Jews settle in Shechem right now? What's Nablus? No. Do Jews have any real significant settlement in Hebron? Outside of Hebron, they do, but it's really hard to settle in Hebron. Do Jews have the ability to pray as per their Torah on the Temple Mount? No, they do not. And these are the three places which the sages point out that we paid quite well for. Our greatest patriarchs and kings paid for these places good money so that they would be the eternal heritage of the Jewish people. And why? Because we have to hold on to them. It teaches us that perhaps by rights it is ours and not those of others. Very strange. There are others who are fighting over Jewish burial places, and the Jewish places of worship are the most valuable places that our opponents have to take away from us. We don't take away from them, but they got to take it from us. So this teaches us this valuable lesson. That's why it says that they were bought them. So I said that there's a fallacy here connecting the ark to this heter bamot. Yeah, we shouldn't ever do that. We shouldn't try to make connections. Sometimes our human brains try to find a link, or we try to say like there's a post hoc ergo propter hoc and other ideas. This two things happen in tandem or sometimes right after each other, so we make a causal link between the two of them. That's not the case. Yes, the ark was absent in Nov and Givon, but that doesn't mean that was what resulted in the heter bamot. There's an interesting section over here in Kings basically saying where what happened. What was the cause of the heter bamot? It says that Solomon really loved God. This is when he was first king, before he even built the temple. He went in the paths of his father David and his chukot, his statutes. Rak bamot, who's mizabeach umaktir. But you should just know he was sacrificing the bamot. But what was the reason for that? And it says that he went to the sanctuary in Givon, Lizboach Sham, Ki hi Bama Gedola. That was the great bama, which we'll see soon. What does that mean? That was the great bama. And he made 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar, because that's where the Mishkan was. Right before that, we see that when he married Pharaoh's daughter, that was in preparation for building the temple. And that was before he built the temple. It says, Rakam is Abechim Bamamot. The people were sacrificing at these bamot. Why? Ki lo nivna vayit l'shem Hashem adei mimahem, because the temple had not yet been built. And that says that Solomon did offer at these bamot also. And he basically, before he built the temple, he decided, I have to limit my sacrifice to the one place where there's an official mizbeach. But this verse is very explicit. Why were the people sacrificing in altar during King David's time and the beginning of Solomon's reign? Because the temple had not yet been built. Nothing having to do with the Ark of the Covenant, by the way. That's a very important verse. And then after the temple was built, they should have stopped. But the problem was they didn't stop. That was a very big problem. So hold on, we're actually getting questions. Or anybody viewing right now, if you have any questions, just interrupt me, because we're approaching the end of what we're doing for tonight. So this verse, I think, is very clearly, that's why Rambam takes his position. That's why the Talmud takes his position. I don't think there's a way to resolve it with what the Meiri says. I could be proven wrong. If someone has something to show me, please do so. So we have here this concept of the bama. One could have argued that if a great bama is at Givon, an ordinary mar bama is any other private altar, then, well, what happened? David decided that there was going to be a permanent altar in Jerusalem. The altar that he found where he offered sacrifice and what stopped the plague, that was technically a bama, even though it is going to become the central altar. The central altar is in Givon, and now he's made an altar in Jerusalem where there's going to be the permanent altar. And the Ark of the Covenant is already in Jerusalem, and there's an altar in front of that one also. You might have had a havamina to say that, okay, now that we know that this altar in Jerusalem is to become the main altar, it already has that status. My nafkamina, you can actually bring the public sacrifices in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount during King David's reign and during Solomon's reign before the temple's built. You would have thought to do that. Kamash Malan, what's trying to teach us with this is that no, this Bama Gedolah was still the altar, the one where God wanted us to offer sacrifice. And that's what it says in Chronicles. It says that even when David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and put an altar in front of it and said, the Mikdash will be here, that which he had there at that altar was still only for his own private purposes. And that's why it says, read this section in Chronicles very clearly, read it slowly, read it clearly, you'll see. He said, the high priest, the priests, the family of Tzadok, they're in charge of the altar in Givon, that they have to do exactly as the Torah says. Only Kohanim can serve on that altar. That's where they have the showbread. That's where the menorah. That's where they have the Yom Kippur service. That's the only place where you could do Korban Pesach. But the altar that David built in Jerusalem, in front of the Ark of the Covenant, no less, and where the temple is going to be standing, that one is still considered a minor bama. That one you could even have Levium in charge, because Levium normally don't do the sacrifice, but on a bama you could even have an Israelite do the sacrificial service. He put the Levium in charge there. It was only basically the Ark of the Covenant within a tent and an altar outside. That's all it was. There was no menorah, there was no kior, there was no incense altar, all the things that you would have in a regular temple. And we've seen that this place, Givon, has quite an interesting history, which we'll get into next week, or God willing. And that'll bring it to the end of what we have to see tonight, unless there's questions. Okay, people can hear me and see me. Let's see, we got something coming in on this way. There's some questions we have to see. Just give me some of your patience here. No, okay, I'll have to listen to these questions because they're audio questions. So we'll just end it here. Okay, it is my, once again, oh wait, here we got the question. In terms of rebuilding the temple today, how we know exactly where to put the Mizbeach? We can measure it. We see on that map that these elevations that we're discussing on last a few nights ago, and we'll continue seeing, those are still there. The Temple Mount's topography has not changed in all these years. And we know from Masechet Midot where it's supposed to be. Not only that, the Muslims did us a good favor because there were traditional Jews who showed them that's where our temple used to stand. So that's where they put the Dome of the Rock, basically. That's also what the Red Baz mentions. So we know very well where the altar was. And even though there might be some doubt, it's a few feet this way, a few feet that way, we're talking about an altar, once again, that was basically more than 47 feet, 47 feet across, and at a perimeter of close to 200 feet. It's a huge edifice. And we only need to put an altar over part of that area. The entire area is kosher for the altar. So we know where to put the Mizbeach. By me, I don't know myself, but the people who are supposed to know. You could point it out on a map very clearly where the altar is standing. It's like they said, for example, shechting a giraffe. There's a bubba mice out there. Some people think that you can't eat a giraffe because you don't know where to shecht it. And that's the exact opposite. No, giraffe has the longest neck of all the kosher animals. You have like 7 feet of place where you can make the incision and properly slaughter that kosher animal. It's like missing the broad side of a barn. So we know where to put the altar, at least by we, I said, there are those among us scholars, the people who need to know where to do it. And that's the least of our questions. We've seen all sorts of other questions. What are they supposed to make the big day kahuna out of? I think that the whole idea of what is the argaman supposed to be? We do not have argaman that Rambam has and all these other doubts. Those have to be worked out. Rav Aryeh Kaplan said one day, all it takes is Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin decides. Even if the Sanhedrin is historically wrong, they come to a conclusion that a previous Sanhedrin did not come to. That is what the Torah Shabbal Peh says. So we just need a Sanhedrin to work these things out, and we could go about doing it. Once again, it's my sincere prayer that we all start engaging in these mitzvot starting tomorrow at night. We don't build the temple, but there's plenty of time tomorrow, and that we have this all ready in time for Passover. So have a good night and be well.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.